Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Lecture Series. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's go see what they have for us today.
Good morning, I'm Leanne. I'm the lecture coordinator for the Peninsula Seniors. Today we have Peter Small joining us as President Thomas Jefferson. Peter Small has performed for national audiences at the Ronald Reagan, Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, and George Bush presidential libraries. He's also appeared on the History Channel. Peter Small's choice to portray Thomas Jefferson near the 4th of July is fitting, given the role Jefferson played in drafting the most important document in the history of the United States.
Well, it is a great honor to have you here at my home of Monticello, here in the hills of Western Virginia, where I've spent so much of my past 83 years. And I'm now in the twilight of my life. And I plan to spend my final days here. And when I'm finally called to my Maker, I plan to be buried here in the soil of my native state of Virginia, and be buried here at Monticello. And I've already designed a tombstone to be placed on my final resting place. And I want my tombstone to read with the following inscription: "Here lies Thomas Jefferson, author of Virginia's Statute on Religious Liberty, founder and president of the University of Virginia, and author of the Declaration of Independence of the United States." I consider those to be my three greatest achievements. Oh yes, I realize most of you know me and recognize me as the third President of the United States, second Vice President of the United States, first Secretary of State of the United States, Minister to France, Governor of Virginia, member of the Continental Congress, and member of Virginia's House of Burgesses. And while I'm known to many of you as a statesman, politician, and public figure, I also consider myself to be a philosopher, author, scientist, inventor, architect, and farmer. Why, my very home of Monticello was actually built according to my design. This is one of the plans I used in the construction of my home, where I've spent the last 60 years designing, redesigning, as well as rebuilding this home. And I have supervised the more than 300,000 bricks that were used in its construction. And in my home, you can also see many of the things that I personally invented for my use and comfort. They include lounges and chairs that I designed for my use and comfort, a polygraph machine where I'm able to write 2 letters simultaneously. Some of you would call that a copying machine. A dumbwaiter elevator where I'm able to bring up wine from the basement to the dining hall for the use and comfort of my guests. A clock which tells not just the minute and hour of the day, but the very day of the week. Now, in order to tell all 7 days of the week properly, I had 2 sets of chains, one on either side of the clock, with 7 sets of cannonballs, and it would descend each day, or would descend each day for all 7 days of the week. The problem was I actually had to make a hole in the floor of my home to tell all 7 days of the week properly. And of course, I will never forget the day that I arrived here. It was a snowy, blizzardy New Year's Day of January 1st, 1772, when I arrived here with my young bride. She was a lovely young widow by the name of Martha Wales Skelton, and we were to spend 10 wonderful and blissful years of marriage together. Excuse me, I hope you'll pardon me, but I can't help but thinking about the many pregnancies miscarriages and births that she suffered through. And after the birth of our last child, she never recovered, and she laid there on her deathbed. I held her hand, and I swore to her that if she left me, I would never marry again. And it has been more than 40 years since she has left this life, and I have kept that promise, and I have never married again. As for the remainder of my family, we had a son who died in infancy, whom we never named, a daughter Lucy who died in childhood. My daughter Molly died in childbirth while I was president, and the only one of my children who has survived is my eldest daughter Martha, my dearest Patsy, who has blessed me with 11 grandchildren, who will see to it that the seed of Jefferson continues. As for myself, I was born not far from here at Shadwell. That was the home of my parents, Jane Randolph and Peter Jefferson, on the 13th of April, 1743. And as I grew into adolescence, I went east to Williamsburg, at that time the capital of the colony of Virginia, where I continued with my formal studies at the College of William and Mary. And it was there I learned and studied and was influenced by such great ideas as the philosophies of Montesquieu, Locke, Rousseau, the discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton, and many others, which not just influenced me, but influenced our young nation and our world. Upon completion of my studies, I was sworn in before the bar of Virginia and began to practice law here in my home county of Albemarle County. Eventually, I was elected to represent my county in our constituent colonial assembly, the Virginia House of Burgesses. But it was very obvious by the 1770s that the ties between Great Britain, the mother country, and the American colonies were beginning to unravel. A parliament that sat thousands of miles away in London, England, a parliament which claimed to represent all Englishmen, began to impose laws upon us controlling our trade and commerce. They began to levy taxes upon us without our consent or approval. This parliament claimed to represent all Englishmen. Well, were we not Englishmen here in America? And did we not have the rights of Englishmen? Where were our elected representatives in that parliament? Where was our voice? There was no one there whom we elected or who spoke for us. The cry went out from the colonies, no taxation without representation. We petitioned the British King and Parliament for redress of our grievances, but our petitions and protests were ignored or rejected by both King and Parliament. And when the good people of Massachusetts stood up to protest in April of 1775, King George and the British Parliament responded by force of arms against the good people of that colony. We of the 13 American colonies decided to take action. We met as a Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was elected one of several delegates from the colony of Virginia. It was there we voted to raise a Continental Army to resist British aggression. And to lead this new Continental Army, we elected my fellow Virginian, George Washington, as Commander-in-Chief. But it was very obvious by 1776 there could be no reconciliation with Great Britain. And I will never forget that day of June of 1776, when my fellow Virginian, Richard Henry Lee, offered the following resolution: that these united colonies ought to and declare themselves to be free and independent states, and that we are to absolve ourselves from all ties from Great Britain and the British Empire. A committee was chosen to write such a declaration. They included Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, John Adams of Massachusetts. Oh, I am sure you all recognize his name. My predecessor as president, friend, colleague, and ally in wartime, later peacetime rival and opponent in politics, but now reconciled friend of letters. And the other two members of that committee included, well, one man who in 1776 was probably the most prominent and respected American in the world. Printer, publisher, author, philosopher, scientist, inventor, and statesman. I'm sure you all know whom I'm talking about, Dr. Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Oh, and the final member of that committee included yours truly, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. But when it came to the task of writing such a declaration, it was quite obvious that it was going to fall upon the shoulders of Dr. Franklin, Mr. Adams, and myself. And I recall I approached Dr. Franklin and I said, "Sir, you must write this declaration, for you are the oldest and wisest among us. It is you who must pen this important document." And Dr. Franklin declined because he was afraid he might insert a joke into the declaration. And then I approached Mr. Adams. I said, "After all, Mr. Adams," I said, "you have been most vocal on behalf of independence. It is you who must pen this important document." And Mr. Adams then said to me, "No, Mr. Jefferson, you must write it for 3 reasons. One, I'm a Massachusetts man, you are a Virginian, and it should be a Southerner that should be at the head of this business. Second, I am suspected, suspicious, and unpopular, whereas you are not. And reason number 3, you can write 10 times better than I can." Well, with that encouragement, I returned to the Graff home where I was renting a room, and I was to spend the next 3 weeks of June and July of 1776 writing what I wanted to be was an expression of the American mind and spirit. And as I spent those 3 weeks of June and July of 1776 writing the Declaration, I was contemplating. I thought to myself, what gave us the right to declare independence? Upon which basis were we to declare independence? What were to be the founding principles of our nation? And then I realized the same laws which exist in nature are the same laws that exist between human beings and their governments. Well, let me explain. When I take this apple, and I mention the name of Sir Isaac Newton, we all think of the laws of gravity. It is gravity that causes the apple to fall. It is gravity that holds us to the planet Earth. And it is gravity that creates the order in our solar system. Now, before the discoveries of Newton, Galileo, and Copernicus, many people believed that the Earth, as represented by this apple, was the center of our universe, with the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the planets revolving around us. But we know, thanks to the discoveries of Newton, Galileo, and Copernicus, that it is the sun, as represented by my fist, that is the center of our solar system, with the Earth revolving around the sun in its orbit every 365 days, as do the other known planets revolve around the sun in their orbit, and the moon revolving around us every 28 days. The same exact logic exists between people and their governments. Now, in my time, most governments were monarchies, ruled by kings and queens. Many of them ruled by what they called divine right, that they ruled in the name of God, and that we, the people, were there to be their subjects. But, ladies and gentlemen, the reason we organize governments is not for us to serve His or Her Majesty. We organize governments to protect our rights and our property, and that when governments no longer protect our rights and our property, then we have the right to change it by every means necessary. And that is what I wanted to express in the Declaration of Independence. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to advance from that subordination which they have hereto remained. No. Let's see. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Well, after all, a nation is no different than any other living creature. We began in our infancy as settlements. We grew into our childhood as colonies. We developed into our adolescence as self-governing colonies, taking upon more responsibility. And now we have become fully mature, adult, independent states. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. That, no. See, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, the entire concept of rights, where does that come from? They don't come from governments. Governments do not issue us those rights. They come from a power greater and mightier than any of us. Call it a God, a Jehovah, an Allah, a mighty spirit. Whatever you wish to call it, is the same power that created the order in our universe, that gave us those rights, and no government can take them away from us. That among these are life, liberty, and property. Well, we do have the right to own property. I'm sure you would agree. Now, I know we are not born with property. Yes, some of us are fortunate to inherit it. Some of you have the means to purchase it. And perhaps some of you will go into our new Western territories and settle the land yourself and become property owners and have a stake in the future of our republic. Well, we certainly have the right to pursue it. Ah, yes, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. No. Well, it would be to our satisfaction, would it not? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of satisfaction. No? Let's see, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. As I said, the reason we organize governments is to protect our rights and our property. Now, we had peacefully petitioned the British King and Parliament for a redress of our grievances. But when those petitions and protests were ignored or rejected by King and Parliament, and they sent their army against the good people of Massachusetts, we had no other choice but to take up armed struggle against the British Empire. And then I continued, in paragraph after paragraph, in clause after clause, detailing and outlining how the King and Parliament had violated their own laws against their own subjects in their courts, in their parliaments, in trade and commerce on sea and on land. And then I condemned King George for the following. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation hither. This piratical warfare is the warfare of the King of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He has prohibited his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this commerce, and this assemblage of horrors might want no fact. Yes, I condemned King George for his support of the slave trade, but when I brought this draft before the Continental Congress, Georgia and South Carolina objected. And so for the purposes of national unity, it was deleted from the final draft, adopted draft of the Declaration. And yet it has been nearly 50 years since I wrote those words, and I am still haunted by them. Well, after all, I've taken an oath before Almighty God to resist every form of tyranny over the minds of man. My motto is, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. And yet, as many of you know, I am still a slave owner. Yes, I agree with you that slavery is wrong. Yes, I know it is morally wrong. But without my slaves, I would not be able to maintain my plantation here at Monticello, and I would be further in debt than I am today. And if we were to immediately emancipate all of the slaves without giving them an education, without teaching them a trade or a skill, I'm afraid we would descend into a civil war between both of our races. I mean, we have been separated for so long, I do not know if peaceful integration is possible. And yet I know we must begin to take important measures and steps. Well, I have already taught some of my own slaves how to read and write. I've taught some of them a trade and a craft and a skill that when I am no longer here, perhaps they may be able to gradually take their place into white society. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, we forbid slavery in the new territories of the Northwest. I believe by keeping slavery out of those northwestern territories and admitting them as free states, that eventually the entire institution of slavery will contract and die. As President of the United States, I signed into law forbidding the importation of slaves into the United States after January 1st, 1808. But this question of slavery, which I feel is a fire bell in the night for our young republic, is a question that will have to be faced, not by my generation, but by yours and future generations. Oh, before I continue, I need to speak to you about some rumors you may have heard. Yes, you know which rumors I am talking about. The rumors that have been printed by the opposition press. Yes, the same opposition press that claimed I would burn the churches and the Bibles if I were elected president. Yes, you know those rumors about mulatto mistresses, slave children. Well, I have never written or said anything about it until today. Now, most of my slaves were inherited, first from my parents and, nearly 200 from my own father-in-law, John Wales. And one family of slaves in particular, the Hemmings family, who have worked very closely with me here in the mansion. Sally and Madison Hemmings, who are brother and sister, actually accompanied me to France when I was minister there during the 1780s. And they and their other siblings have worked so closely with me here in the mansion that I sometimes feel like we're almost family. Well, there is some truth to that. You see, Sally, Madison, and all of their siblings were all conceived and fathered by my own father-in-law, John Wales. Yes, Sally Hemmings is my half-sister-in-law. But these stories you've heard about mulatto mistresses and slave children, I have never written or said anything about it, and I never will. And then I concluded in the Declaration, we, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be, free and independent states, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. When I brought the Declaration before the Continental Congress, they debated over it for several days, editing and deleting much of the hard work and effort that I'd put into writing this important document. Naturally, I was quite hurt and offended when they did that. But Dr. Franklin told me a story. He told me a story about a man named John Thompson. Mr. Thompson was a hatter, and he had a sign that said, John Thompson, with a picture of a hat. Underneath it said, makes hats, sells for ready money. Well, people looked at it and they said, of course he sells it for ready money. You don't believe he gives it away on credit. That was removed. Makes hats, I think that's obvious. That was removed. All that remained was the name and the picture of the hat. And I never forgot that. And when it came time to sign the Declaration, John Hancock was the first to sign the Declaration. He was the president of the Continental Congress. He said he wanted his signature so large, he said so John Bull, the symbol of Great Britain, could read it without his spectacles. But ladies and gentlemen, we were risking everything. Not merely our homes, our property, and our wealth, but our families and our very lives. For if we lost, we would all be hanging at the end of a British noose. But after 6 years of armed struggle and 2 years of negotiations, we finally won our independence from Great Britain. And now we had the responsibility of governing our new nation. I was proud to serve our new nation as our minister to France. When I arrived at the court of King Louis in Versailles to present my credentials, they said to me, "Oh, Monsieur Jefferson, you are here to replace Benjamin Franklin." I said, "No, I'm here to succeed him, for no one can replace Benjamin Franklin." In 1789, President Washington nominated me to become the first Secretary of State in his new administration. And I was proud to serve in President Washington's new administration. Now, I'd also strongly supported our new federal Constitution of 1787. I felt that was the best way to preserve our independence and our liberties. But when I entered the Washington administration, I also brought with me my political philosophy, that is one based upon states' rights. I believe that the role of the national government should be limited to protect the rights of the states and the individual. Unfortunately, my opposite number in the cabinet, the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, seemed to disagree with me at every move. He believed in a federalist philosophy of a strong central government centered in our cities in mercantilism, commerce, and industry. Oh, to me, the cities are nothing more than scabs upon the body of our nation. I believe the future of our nation is in our farmers. They are the chosen people of God. Not the only time Mr. Hamilton and I ever agreed on anything was in 1792, when we both urged President Washington to stand for re-election as president. We felt only his presence could hold our fragile new republic together. But in 1793, war broke out again between Britain and France, and again Mr. Hamilton and I disagreed. He felt we should support Britain because we trade with Great Britain. I felt we should support France because we had a treaty of alliance with France. They had supported us in our cause of independence, and now they were experiencing their own revolution, inspired by our revolution. But I was very disappointed with the reaction and response of President Washington when he chose the course of neutrality. So I resigned in protest from the cabinet and returned here to Monticello, where I began to view with increasing alarm the increasing influence of Mr. Hamilton and his Federalist faction over President Washington. And those who shared my concern, we began to organize ourselves into a new political faction or political party. We called ourselves Republicans or Democratic Republicans in opposition to the Federalists. In 1796, I stood as a candidate, as my party's candidate for president in that election against the Federalist standard bearer, my old friend and the Vice President, John Adams. And Mr. Adams narrowly defeated me in the Electoral College. But according to the law at that time, who was ever second in the electoral vote was elected Vice President. So in March of 1797, I was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. But 3 years later, in late 1800, the ticket of Aaron Burr and I defeated Mr. Adams for re-election. However, according to the Constitution at that time, the electors were to vote for two people. The first choice was president. The second choice was vice president. What happened was Mr. Burr and I were first, and we were tied in the Electoral College. According to the Constitution, if no one has an outright majority, the choice of president is made by the House of Representatives, with each state voting as a single unit. That means a state as small as Delaware has as many votes as a state as large as my native state of Virginia, one each. And you needed a majority of state delegations to elect the new president. It took the House of Representatives 36 ballots, 36 times, until I was finally elected the third president of the United States. And I consider my election a revolution. Well, after all, I have said that a nation needs a good revolution every 20 or 30 years. It's as natural to human beings as storms are to nature. But my revolution was a peaceful revolution, a peaceful change of government from Mr. Adams to me, from his political philosophy to mine, and from his political party to mine. Now, while President Washington set many fine examples for Mr. Adams and myself to follow, I'm afraid that as president, Mr. Washington had a rather royal tone about him. Oh, I recall many times that he would travel. He would travel in a carriage, accompanied by men on horseback, not as if he were an elected head of a republic representing its citizens, but as if he were a monarch. And Mr. Adams continued with that practice. Well, I felt it was time to restore some Republican simplicity to our government. So when I arrived in Washington, D.C. in March of 1801 to be inaugurated as our third president, I did not stay in a great inn or mansion. I actually stayed in a boarding house. I shared a room with several strange men. And on the day of my inauguration, I did not arrive on horseback or in a carriage. Like a common citizen, I walked on foot from the boarding house to our new Capitol. There I was sworn in as president. I read my inaugural speech, and I returned to the boarding house. Eventually, I moved into the new presidential mansion, where I continued with my Republican style. I recall once the ambassador from Great Britain came to visit me at the president's house, and I greeted him wearing my bathrobe and slippers. I represent the people of this nation, not His Majesty the King. My greatest achievement as president, well, I think that one is quite obvious. That was the purchase of Louisiana. And when I talk about Louisiana, I am not talking about what is today the state of Louisiana. I am talking about the territory between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. When I was inaugurated president in 1801, our nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. Settlers and their families were crossing the Appalachian Mountains into the new states of Kentucky and Tennessee and into the new territories of the future states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. These settlers were farmers. They needed to get their goods to market, and the only way they could do that was sailing down the Mississippi River Valley through the port of New Orleans into the Gulf of Mexico. However, New Orleans was under the control of France, and any nation that controlled New Orleans, be it France, Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, or Spain, any one of those nations that controlled New Orleans easily controlled 3/8 of our commerce. It was important and imperative that we gain control of New Orleans. So I sent my two ministers, Mr. Robert Livingston and James Monroe, to France to negotiate with the then First Consul and later Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was fighting a war for all-out control of Europe. He desperately needed cash to finance his military campaigns, and he had no need for any additional territory in North America. So for just $15 million, which we later realized was $1 per acre, which was considered a great bargain even in my time, and with the stroke of a pen, I doubled the size of the United States. But we had no idea what existed in this territory. It had never been fully explored before. I mean, was there perhaps a Northwest Passage, a water route to the Pacific Ocean? What about the animal life, the vegetation, the geography, the climate, the Indian life? We had to find out what was there. So I asked my personal secretary, Mr. Meriwether Lewis, and his good friend, Mr. William Clark, to organize an expedition of discovery to explore this new territory. So in 1804, at the junction of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, just north of the present town of St. Louis, they sailed up the Missouri River, they crossed the Rocky Mountains, sailed down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean, where they spent the winter. When spring came, they sailed up the Columbia, portaged, crossed the Missouri River, and sailed back, and after 2 years came back with the most complete report on that territory. No, there was no Northwest Passage or water route to the Pacific Ocean, but their description of this territory made me realize we had made the right decision, because I believe this territory will satisfy thousands upon thousands of generations of Americans. As I told you, the future of our nation is in our farmers. By going west, they will develop and cultivate this area, and by becoming property owners, they will become voters who will see that our nation will grow and strengthen. To think we spent only $15 million on the entire Lewis and Clark expedition, on the entire Louisiana Purchase, and only $2,500 on the entire Lewis and Clark expedition. At the end of my second term, I decided to follow the example set by President Washington and retire. I felt my 8 years as president were nothing more than a splendid misery. So I returned here to Monticello, and what I have been concerned about these past years is that if we're to be a great nation, we need to have great centers of public learning. Now, many of you may recall after our last war with Great Britain in 1814, when British troops actually attacked and invaded our capital city of Washington, D.C., burning the Capitol, the President's House, and the Library of Congress. I sold many of the books here in my library to help rebuild the Library of Congress and to make it a great repository of learning for our fellow citizens. And that has led me to one last final project. If we're to be a great nation, we need to have great centers of public learning. That is why I became the founder, the architect, and president of the University of Virginia, located not far from here in Charlottesville, Virginia. As its architect, I designed the buildings where the students would learn and live. As its president, I designed the curriculum deciding what the students would learn, because if we're to be a great nation, we need to train and educate a new generation of leaders who will be able to take over when we are no longer here. And now it is 1826. Why, do you realize that next July 4th will mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of this nation? And of those 56 of us who signed the Declaration of Independence, only 3 of us remain alive. They include Mr. Carroll of Maryland, Mr. Adams of Massachusetts, and he is more than 90 years old, and I'm already 83 years old. And I do hope that both Mr. Adams and I will be able to live to next July 4th, to see the 50th anniversary of the founding of this republic. And I do hope I will be able to live to that day, so I may be able to finally ask this one last question. Is this the 4th? Now, I would like to thank all of you for coming here to Monticello today. And if you have any questions for me about my life, my times, my presidency, or any other questions you may have for me, Mr. Jefferson, I will be happy to answer them. And don't hesitate about any questions you may have. I've just about exposed my life before you as any public official could. How do I feel about my naval policy and how it led to the War of 1812? You know, I did believe in limited government, but I found I even had to build up our Navy. First, in response to the Barbary pirates that were attacking our ships off the coast of North Africa, and I sent Stephen Decatur to Tripoli to finally force them to stop attacking our ships. And of course, we were harassed by both French and British ships during my administration. The Chesapeake incident was an example of that, and I knew we had to build up our Navy and prepare it to defend ourselves in case of a future war, which of course happened during the administration of my successor, Mr. Madison. How did I reconcile with John Adams? Well, that happened after I left the presidency. Through a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Benjamin Rush, he suggested to Mr. Adams that he write to me. And I responded to Mr. Adams. After all, Mr. Adams reminded me that, yes, we had our political differences, but we also had so much in common. He reminded me of our friendship during our war and struggle for independence, when we had so much in common. After all, we had helped found this nation, and we had so many positive and wonderful experiences together establishing this nation. And he reminded me of that, and I wrote him back. And during the past 8 years, while we have not seen each other again, we have renewed our friendship through warm personal correspondence. You mean, how did I feel about Aaron Burr shooting Alexander Hamilton? Well, I never cared for Mr. Hamilton, nor did Mr. Burr, but I think Mr. Hamilton probably despised Mr. Burr more than me. That's why he had his supporters elect me President of the United States. And personally, I never trusted Mr. Burr, especially after that election. One of his electors was supposed to withhold their vote for him and elect me president. Now, I never did trust Mr. Burr. And then, of course, after he murdered Mr. Hamilton, I know dueling was legal in New Jersey, but it was murder in New York. I decided to drop him as my running mate or candidate for vice president in the election of 1804. Oh, but this wasn't the end of Mr. Burr. We caught him conspiring with Spanish agents on the Ohio River, planning to set up his own empire in the Southwest. We put him on trial. Unfortunately, that trial was presided over by that last-minute appointment to the Supreme Court, that midnight appointment by Mr. Adams, Mr. John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice and presiding over that trial. And the problem was, according to our Constitution, you need 2 witnesses to testify and establish treason. We could only find 1. As a result, Mr. Burr was acquitted. Oh, how I would have liked to have seen him convicted and imprisoned, but at least that was the end of his political career. About my other inventions and my farming, yes, I invented a plow. And all of my inventions I never patented. I was donating that to mankind. I was following an example that Benjamin Franklin did. And my farming, I kept many notes about what I farmed, and I was able to bring over other seeds from Europe and develop other different kinds of vines to grow here at Monticello, including many new wines that we are able to develop from these new hybrids of grapes. And I also brought over some interesting foods from Europe. One was ice cream, which my predecessor's wife, Dolly Madison, has popularized at the President's house. And the French taught me an interesting way to cook potatoes. Fry them in oil. And I even found from Italy mixing macaroni and cheese. If I was to come into your time, what would I still see of mine? Well, I would still hope to see that our republic functions, that of course, the three equal branches of government, that the rights of the individual are respected, and as well as the rights of the states and of the local governments, and that we are a functioning democratic republic, as we set out to be. What is my opinion of Dr. Franklin's private life? That's his private business. After all, even though I've told you a little about my private life, but not much more than I wish to tell you. Now, I know there was some criticism of Dr. Franklin at the French court of flirting with the ladies of the French court. Well, he was already widowed at the time. But I understand the reason he did it was to gain their favor so they would influence their husbands to support our cause of independence. And apparently he was quite successful. He did sign a treaty of alliance with France, and without French military help, why, we would not have been able to defeat the British, especially at the critical Battle of Yorktown. Any regrets? Well, I regret we did not convict Aaron Burr. And I wish we, and yes, and the Embargo Acts of 1807. After all, remember, Britain and France were at war. Our ships were being harassed and even attacked by British and French ships, particularly the British. And I urged the Congress to pass a series of laws called the Embargo Acts, which forbid trading with any belligerent nation. That way, I felt if we did not trade with any of them, it would hurt them. Instead, it hurt us worse, especially New England, that was dependent upon trade with Europe. And eventually, I had those laws repealed before the end of my administration. What is my opinion of George Washington, that we called him the father of our nation? Now, I did have my disagreements with President Washington. I felt we should have supported France back in 1793, and I did resign in protest, and I did object to his rather royal style of presiding over the nation. But yes, you are right. Thanks to his leadership during our War of Independence, and yes, even his leadership as president, it helped establish our nation, to which we are, of course, indebted to his service. Yes, if there are any in particular that you can think of, are you interested about? Such as Mr. Adams. Of course, he and I were good friends during that time. Of course, he did not get along with Benjamin Franklin. The problem is that I think he was jealous of Dr. Franklin's fame when he went to Europe. And he would get up very early in the morning while Dr. Franklin would sleep late. And of course, I think some of you are familiar with my second vice president. I think you have all heard of him. His name is Clinton. George Clinton. What was my salary as president? $25,000 a year. I think that's a reasonable salary, don't you think? Even though I am now in debt, but that's because of some bad business decisions. And of course, with farming, you do not know the crop. You can have a good crop one year, a bad crop another. And unfortunately, people have accused me of living beyond my means. And I do like to wear nice clothes and have fine wines, don't you? Well, I've never counted the exact number of servants and slaves that I had in my house, but I had at least 200 slaves on the entire property of Monticello. Well, without them, I would be further in debt than I am today. Yeah. Flogged, not when I was there. Why, when I returned from France in 1789, they all came out to cheer me. They were delighted to see my return, and I tried to treat them fairly when I was there at the plantation. You say in your day you celebrated Independence Day with fireworks, with parades, with meals and picnics. We began to do the same thing in our time. I recall John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail. I remember he wrote that July 2nd, 1776 would be celebrated throughout the continent with bells, games, fireworks, bonfires. The only thing he was wrong about was the date. Oh, why July 2nd? Well, that was the day we voted for independence. It was July 4th that we adopted the Declaration of Independence. You asked me about the Star-Spangled Banner, about bombs bursting in air. Oh, that's a poem that I believe a Mr. Francis Scott Key wrote when he was observing the bombardment of Fort McHenry during our last war with Great Britain. And I understand he wrote it and they put it to a tune of a beer drinking song, an acronym in heaven. And you say that's a national anthem? A beer drinking song? Oh. America the Beautiful, which I have not heard, but I think that would be a very good name for a national anthem. I agree with you, rather than some beer drinking song. Why did I compromise on many issues when they were editing the Declaration of Independence, including slavery? Well, first of all, when they were debating that, I said nothing during that time. I sat back, and it was Mr. Adams who was doing the debating with the other delegates. Well, first of all, concerning slavery, we deleted it so not to offend the southern states and to maintain national unity. There were others who said I was too harsh in my tone towards the British people. They explained that, well, since many of our families had come from Great Britain, that our real argument was not with the British people, but with the British government. Well, as I mentioned, my parents were Jane Randolph and Peter Jefferson. My father passed away when I was just 13, very traumatic, of course, to any young person. And my mother played a smaller role in my life, and not as great as an influence as my father was. Well, of course, we grew wheat, we grew tobacco. We also grew, of course, we grew grapes, which we could use for wine. No cotton. That would be, well, we were in a hillier area. The cotton was more suitable towards the flatlands. And, of course, not until 1793 was it even economical to grow cotton, thanks to the cotton gin, which removed the seeds, which made it very economically feasible to grow cotton. We will end with the questions from Mr. Jefferson, and I will step out of character and have questions for Peter Small. You asked me before how I got into this. More than 25 years ago, back in the late 1980s, I decided to go into education, to become a U.S. history teacher. And when I was doing classroom observations, substituting, student teaching, what else? Other teaching experiences, I was doing these historical presentations or these costume presentations for my classes as part of the lessons. And for the last 20 years, I've been going out and developing and doing this professionally. At 4 presidential libraries. As a matter of fact, July 4th, 2013, I will be at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, my second year as Thomas Jefferson. And for the Nixon Library's Meet the President series in July of 2013. For my 5th year, as 1 week as Thomas Jefferson, another week as Theodore Roosevelt. And of course, I have been here before doing other characters such as Harry Truman and Golda Meir. I also do actually a total of 9 different historical portrayals. I've added, although it's not in my brochure, I've added I mentioned Theodore Roosevelt, John Adams, Moses, the lawgiver, I also do Thomas Edison, Franklin Roosevelt. I mentioned Harry Truman. No, not Henry Ford. No, it's Washington, Jefferson, John Adams, Thomas Edison, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Golda Meir, and Moses. I think I got them all. How much preparation? An excellent question. A lot. No, it's serious. Some of these are people that I've been reading about since I was a child. It's obviously a subject I've been interested in. But yes, it takes many months, not just to read several books and several different sources, figuring out what are the important things to be said, what is to be said, how is it to be told. Even, what you saw today, it took many, it just didn't just happen overnight. It took years of developing it to find out what works with an audience, what new information to add. Sometimes I will tell you, one of the best sources I get are from audiences from question and answer periods, because certain questions will, particularly depending on the character, certain questions will come up all the time, and then I decide that's what I'm going to add. A good example, Sally Hemings. I would get that question all the time from audiences, so I decided to incorporate it. The only time I make an exception is with an elementary school audience. I will talk about slavery. I mean, after all, even a fifth grader can figure out, how can you say all men are created equal when you own slaves? Unless somebody were to ask the question of in elementary school, I just ignore Sally Hemings. But no, with middle school and up, the question is going to come up anyway, and they're certainly old enough and mature enough to be able to deal with that question. Yes, James K. Polk?
Underrated. There's a lot of material there.
I agree with you, probably, yes. I would agree with you, the most underrated American president. In case nobody knows who I'm talking, James K. Polk was the 11th president of the United States. He said that he had 4 goals in his administration, and he would carry it all, he would complete those 4 goals in one term, and he did. That included gaining control of Texas, Oregon, California, taking care of an independent treasury, and taking care of the tariff. He did it all in one term, and he worked himself to death because he died just 3 months after he left office. He was only 53 years old. The trouble is with Polk, most people wouldn't recognize him, and his question is, would there be an audience for that?
You could rehabilitate.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I agree. I agree. He is the most, I agree, of all the presidents, I think he's the most underrated. And most historians will put him up there, if not in the top 10, pretty close to it. Thank you all very much for having me here.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Senior Lecture Series. I'm Betty Wheaton. See you next time.